Okay, let's finish up our discussion of cognitive or social cognitive approaches to personality. But before I do that, let's just make note of this, which is already in the syllabus. Final exam for this class is scheduled for Monday evening on May 12th. We'll be in 2050 Valley Life Sciences building. It's a nice big room, gives people plenty of room to spread out. Final exams here at Berkeley are 3-hour exam, are scheduled for 3 hours, but the final exam is going to be a 2-hour exam. The first hour will be non-cumulative, and it'll cover all the material since the midterm exam: the self, neuroscience, development, personality, and the material we'll have next week. And it'll be about the size of a midterm, maybe a little bit shorter. And the second hour will be a cumulative midterm that'll give you a chance to put the course together, go back and talk about material from the first half of the course, and so on. So you'll have 2 hours for the exam, and then the third hour you can do what you want. You can keep working on the exam, you can go home, whatever it is you want to do. So that's the story there. We'll have more details on that later. Okay, so last time I began by tracing the evolution of cognitive social learning theories of personality. And you should appreciate the difference between the approach to personality taken by these cognitive social learning theories and other more traditional approaches. Traditional personality theories are usually couched in terms of personality traits, broad behavioral dispositions like extroversion and agreeableness and conscientiousness, the big 5 personality traits that most of you are probably familiar with. And if you think about it for a second, these really don't have any serious cognitive content to them. They're behavioral dispositions. A neurotic person is disposed to be anxious and depressed. An extroverted person is disposed to be outgoing and sociable. An agreeable person is disposed to be nice. But there's nothing about these personality traits that particularly suggests how these individuals think or what they believe or how they perceive the world or whatever. The cognitive social learning theories of personality try to do just that. And you can see that in, for example, Roeder's expectancy value theory of personality, which emphasized not traits like neuroticism and extroversion, but rather expectancies, what the person thinks is going to happen next, and values, what the person prefers, what the person likes, or whatever. These are cognitive dispositions that are held to underlie the individual's behavior in particular situations in much the same way that personality traits are supposed to do. But the difference is that there's explicit cognitive content in these kinds of things. So the evolution of the cognitive social learning theories of personality begins really with Julian Roeder and his expectancy value theory. But notice that what Roeder did was to talk about expectancies and values, but didn't really talk about how these were acquired. It's a cognitive social learning theory of personality, so the implication is that expectancies and values are acquired through some kind of social learning process, but Roeder himself didn't really have too much to say about that. The guy who really spent time talking about the learning process itself was Albert Bandura, is Albert Bandura, he's still alive, still thriving at Stanford, who argued for a new conceptualization of what the learning process is like. Before Bandura, mostly before Bandura, Tolman was a big exception, Berkeley's Tolman, but before Bandura, most learning theorists argued that learning occurred by virtue of some kind of reinforcement process, that the organism would engage in some behavior, that behavior would be rewarded or not, or punished or not, and as a response to reinforcement, that organism's behavior would change in some way, and that's how learning was defined, as a relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs as a result of experience. Now, Bandura argues that yes, there's some kind of experiential basis to all of this, but all the details are different. So for Bandura, we're not talking about a relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs as a result of experience. We're talking about a relatively permanent change in cognition, in expectancies and values and the kinds of things that Roeder was talking about. And the role of experience is quite different. Reinforcement plays very little role in Bandura's theory of social learning. Yes, he acknowledges that there is some degree of learning by response consequences, by trial and error, by the kinds of processes that are involved in classical and instrumental conditioning, but Bandura was much more interested in what he called observational learning, learning just by observing other people, without there being much role for reinforcement at all. And he spent a great deal of time talking about the varieties of observational learning that we experience. 2 chief forms: learning by example, just by watching somebody else do what they do, and learning that way, and learning by precept, being explicitly taught how to do something. So whereas Roeder focused on what's learned, expectancies and values, Bandura talked about the learning process, learning by direct consequences and observational learning. And we'll just kind of skip over this for a little bit. We're not going to talk about teaching here at all. The next step in the evolution of cognitive social learning theories comes from the work of Walter Mischel, who at the time he was doing this was also a professor at Stanford. He was a student of Julian Roeder's at Ohio State. He was a colleague of Albert Bandura's at Stanford. And so it's not surprising that Mischel's cognitive social learning theory approach to personality picks up threads from each of those theories, but Mischel casts his own unique light on these kinds of things. The theory really begins with a critique of traditional trait theories and personality. Personality traits are supposed to do a couple of things. The first thing they do is to render behavior stable. You have a personality trait, it's supposed to operate kind of like a physical trait. If you're tall, you're always tall. If you're skinny, you're always skinny. If you're white, you're always white. If you're extroverted, you're always extroverted. So there's supposed to be some temporal stability to behavior that is given by the fact that behavior is governed by these personality traits. Personality traits are also supposed to render behavior consistent across various kinds of situations. Again, think about the analogy to physical traits. If you're white at home, you're white at school. If you're tall in the gym, you're tall in the movie theater. Similarly, if you're extroverted at home, you're supposed to be extroverted at school as well, because traits are stable, consistent predispositions to behavior that render behavior stable and consistent. Well, Mischel, in one of his earliest works, 1968, reviewed the literature on the stability and consistency of personality and found that it wasn't very strong, that in fact there was a tremendous amount of change that occurs in people's behavior across time and across situations, more change than you would think would be accounted for by traditional notions of personality traits. So the major critique of trait theory is that a person's behavior depends not so much on what personality traits he or she possesses, how high he or she scores on neuroticism or extroversion or anything like that, but rather depends on the situation that the person is in. You behave differently at home with your parents than you do on a date with your girlfriend or boyfriend, than you do at a basketball game with your roommate or whatever. This looks like situationism, and Mischel's critique of personality theory, traditional personality theory, was often castigated as just another example of situationism. But Michel himself was very careful to say that it's not the objective situation that controls behavior, it's a perceived situation that controls the behavior. It's what the person thinks about the situation that he or she is in, or put another way, it's the meaning of the situation. And this meaning is something that can be modified by various kinds of cognitive transformations. You go to the dentist or you go to the doctor, and she tells you, well, we got to do this procedure, and it's kind of painful, and you can think about that procedure as a painful procedure that you've got to get through, or you can think about that procedure as something that's going to improve your overall state of health. How you think about the situation is going to determine what your behavior is in that situation. It's the meaning that really matters, not some objective description of the situation. And Michel himself was very clear about that, although he was often misread, has often been misread on that score. So what Michel basically does is he said, well, look, Bandura has figured out what the social learning process is, that social learning is observational learning, not so much learning by direct consequences. Let's fill in the blanks for the kinds of cognitive variables that are important to personality. Basically reaches back to Roeder, his teacher, to kind of pick up things that Roeder missed. So in his theoretical work, Michel has argued that instead of being characterized by some relatively small set of personality traits, there is a relatively small set of what he called cognitive social learning person variables. That is, cognitive variables that are acquired through social learning that characterize the individual's personality. First of these are what Michel called cognitive and behavioral construction competencies, which is kind of a fancy, jargonistic way of saying what you know how to do. Okay? Are you the kind of person who knows how to make friends? Are you the kind of person who knows how to influence people? Well, if so, you have these construction competencies that you use to get along with other people in the ordinary course of everyday living. This is not the same thing as being agreeable or being conscientious or whatever. It's knowing how to do something, and then you can choose whether you want to do it or not. So these cognitive behavioral construction competencies is the first kind of leg in this theory of personality. The second the set of cognitive social learning person variables that Michel talked about is what he called encoding strategies. And by this, he simply means what you pay attention to and how you process things. And the general idea here is that we all have interests and values and things that mean more or less to us, and we're going to pay attention selectively to various kinds of to various events in the world, to various objects in the world, depending on what our interests are. There are people in the world who are really quick to think of all the horrible things that can happen whenever they engage in some kind of behavior. There are other people in the world who think only about the good, the possible outcomes. That's the kind of thing that Michel talks about when he refers to encoding strategies. What you're going to pay attention to and how you're going to pay attention to it. Then there are expectancies, and these expectancies are pretty much the same kinds of expectancies that Roeder talked about in his expectancy value theory. They come basically in three kinds. First, stimulus outcome expectancies. These are the kinds of expectancies that you acquire through processes not unlike classical conditioning, where an event occurs in the environment, and then by virtue of learning, you learn to anticipate what's going to come next, what's likely to happen after this event. Those are stimulus outcome expectancies. And then there are behavior outcome expectancies, which are likely expectancies that you acquire through instrumental conditioning. Behavior outcome expectancies are, if I do such and such a thing, there's some probability that some outcome is going to occur. So again, the difference here, think about classical instrumental conditioning for a second. Pavlov's dog hears a bell and thinks food's coming. That's a stimulus outcome expectancy. Or Thorndike's, let's do Skinner's pigeons instead. Skinner's pigeons peck at a key in an operant chamber and food is delivered to the hopper. That's a behavior outcome expectancy. A third set of expectancies actually is derived from the work of Bandura. I skipped over this before because I could introduce it here. And this is what Bandura calls self-efficacy expectations. I suppose that I know that if I submit a paper to a particular journal, it's going to get published. Okay, that's kind of a behavior outcome expectancy. But in order to actually submit the paper, in order to write the paper, I got to believe I can do that this is something that I'm capable of doing. It doesn't matter what the behavior outcome expectancy is. What's really important is whether I can engage in the behavior that's likely to lead to a particular outcome. So the Bandura, and Michel picked up on this, talks about people's expectations about themselves and what they're capable of. Then there are values, again, picked up directly from Roeder's expectancy value theory, what kinds of preferences you have, what your priorities are like. Michel then introduces this category of self-regulatory systems and plans, by which, again, this is an idea that he picks up a little bit from Bandura. Previous behaviorist or early learning approaches to personality argued, like the situationist, for external control of the person. But what Bandura and Michel understood clearly was that we were able to regulate our own behavior, imposing a system of self-reward or self-punishment in order to accomplish various kinds of tasks. So one of these self-regulatory systems and plans sometimes take the form of what Michel calls priority rules. You get your ducks in a row and figure out what's the most important thing to accomplish, and then after you've done that, then you can do something else. If I make progress on my term paper, then I can go to the movies Friday night. Okay, that's a priority rule, but that's something that you set for yourself. Okay, and then there are these stop rules. For example, if I go to a party, I'm only going to take 2 drinks, or I'm not going to drink at all because I'm the designated driver, or whatever. So there are rules that regulate, self-regulatory rules that regulate when you're going to start something, like these priority rules, and also rules that regulate when you're going to stop something. But they're not rules that are imposed on the individual. There are rules that are imposed by the individual on him or herself. And then finally, where I want to devote most of today is Michel's idea about personal constructs as an important cognitive aspect of personality. And to understand what Michel means by personal constructs, we have to go back to another one of Michel's teachers, a very interesting but also somewhat obscure personality psychologist named George Kelly. To make a long story short, personal constructs are categories. They are the concepts that a person uses to organize his or her own experience and behavior. And Kelly's idea, I'll talk about him more in a minute, was that every individual carries around in his head a repertoire of concepts that he or she uses to organize and make sense of the world. The concepts that I use to organize and make sense of the world are my constructs, and they may differ from the constructs that anybody else uses, even somebody who's relatively close to me. That's why we call them personal constructs. Just to set the deep background for this, let's return, yes? They are not discussed. The big five personality traits are just out of the picture. All personality traits are out of the picture. Yeah, the way a trait like extroversion would translate into the cognitive social learning vocabulary would be something like this. I know how to make friends with people, okay? I want to make friends with people. And so I use my skills, my cognitive behavioral construction competencies to behave in accordance with these kinds of values. But that's not the traditional way of thinking about extroversion as a personality trait, which is one reason why many trait theorists emphasize the genetic determination of personality, this idea that about 50% of variance in a trait like extroversion is determined by the genes. Genes don't have any cognitive content, right? There's no inheritance of what people have learned. The idea there is that you've got some kind of genetic predisposition that makes you outgoing and sociable. I don't know how that's supposed to work exactly, but that's the general idea. But this isn't just a translation exercise. This is a cognitive social learning theory is an entirely new and different way of thinking about personality, precisely because trait theory assumes that behavior is very stable across time, very consistent across situations, very coherent in terms of its hierarchical organization, and that the existence of personality traits makes behavior predictable. Okay, so if I score high on the NEO personality inventory scale of extroversion, I'm supposed to be extroverted all the time. You could expect that of me. Michel early on reviewed the literature on this and found that, in fact, behavior isn't as stable, isn't as consistent, and isn't as predictable as traditional trait theories had led us to expect. In fact, Michel became quite notorious for inventing this concept known as the personality coefficient. And the personality coefficient is the correlation between a person's score on a personality trait and his behavior his trait-related behavior in any particular situation. And what Michel concluded from his review of the literature was that that correlation is about 0.30 as a maximum. Okay, it's not 0. Okay, but it is far from a perfect 1.0. In fact, variance on traditional kinds of personality inventories accounts for only about 10% of actual variance. And Michel says it's just not good enough, right? Now, the idea here is that if you know what a person wants to do, what a person can do, okay, and what the perceived reward structure is for doing that thing, then you can predict what the person's going to do in any particular situation. But the prediction comes not from knowing his personality traits. The prediction comes from knowing his cognitive behavioral construction competencies, his expectancies, his values, and so on. It's a very, very, very different way of thinking about it. You'll see just how different in a second. But let's just kind of go back here. I talk about Jerome Bruner a lot, but it's kind of all of Bruner's psychology can kind of be summarized in 3 aphorisms of his. The first of these is the purpose of perception is action. Okay, the reason we have mental representations, the reason we perceive the world at all, is so that we can take action with respect to the things that we perceive. And the second thing, I'll talk about this a little bit more next week. In order to perceive the world, all the information that's necessary for perception is not supplied by the stimulus. I talked about this point in the lectures on social perception. The perceiver has to go beyond the information of the stimulus, contribute some pre-existing knowledge to form a percept. And then finally, Bruner argued that every act of perception is an act of categorization because in perceiving an object and identifying it, you necessarily classify it as similar to other objects you know and different from other objects that you know. So again, categorization lies at the heart of both perception and action. If I categorize 2 objects, if I classify 2 objects into the same category, then you can expect me to behave much the same way with respect to those 2 objects. But you got to know how I'm going to classify these objects. Well, as I suggested before, personal constructs really is just an alternative term for these categories that we carry around in our head. The term personal constructs comes from a longtime psychologist at Ohio State University named George Kelly, who back as early as 1955, before there even was a cognitive revolution in psychology, was offering a thoroughly cognitive view of personality in terms of what he called a personal construct theory. Kelly's a very interesting guy, basically wrote 2 things in his entire career, a 2-volume book that is almost unreadable. Because what Kelly did was to kind of throw out all the traditional vocabulary of psychology and invent a whole new vocabulary to try to encompass his point of view on personality psychology. It's very, very, very dense book. Many people have it on their shelves, and hardly anybody has ever actually cracked the binding. But it's not beach reading, right? But it's actually worth thinking about. Kelly picked up a theme that began to emerge in psychology in the 1950s of people as naive scientists, having theories about the world and generating hypotheses based on those theories, testing those hypotheses through behavior, and then using the results of the test to revise their theories about the world. That's the general idea behind Kelly's theory, and that these hypotheses are based on personal constructs, okay, on your beliefs, on the categories that you use to organize your perception of the world. Kelly then introduced this very important term, which he called constructive alternativism, and the basic idea behind this is you have lots of different ways to construe an event or an object. And how you construe the event or object is going to determine how you're going to behave with respect to that event or object. And you can make that choice. You can choose to construe an event one way, or you can choose to construe an event another way. If you're having a birthday, one of those milestone birthdays like 40 or 50 or 17 or whatever, you can choose that as a